Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today in our last bonus session that we have talking about the Senate bill SB4-D. This topic has actually been making its way around the industry, and it's becoming a less of what is this new thing, and really now it's starting to settle down just a little bit, and there's a lot more good questions that people are asking, trying to figure out how do I do this and when should I do that. And we're hopeful that today, by the end of this session, you're going to have a lot more answers to some of those pending questions as the dust is starting to settle and you're starting to get to grips with this whole new bill and all these different changes. Now, today's session will be slightly different than our last two sessions. We're going to try to incorporate a lot more of your questions as we go through the different slides. So as we're going through items, if you have questions about the item that we're talking about, put it in the chat or put it up in the question box, and we'll try to address it right then and there so that way we can make sure everybody understands before we move forward. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with me, my name is Rain McGreevy, and I'm from Stromer & Company, full service CPA firm, and I'm one of the directors there. And you have to apologize and hang with me today. I'm kind of getting over a little bit of a sickness, so my apologies if I sound a little nasal and you hear me cough here and there. I assure you I'm doing fine. I just sound a little bit funny. So talking about funny guys, I'm going to turn it over to Richard and allow him to introduce himself.
Hi, folks. I'm Richard DeBost, Godey DeBost & Cross. We're a full-service law firm with, but a primary practice area is condominium and homeowner association law throughout the state of Florida. So I'm glad you're here. I know some of you are new and some of you have probably seen this before, but hopefully we're going to give a little more information. We learn a little bit each time.
All right, perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and get this presentation started. And I hope everybody can see the screen, the legislative update. Richard, we look good?
Yeah, it looks great.
All right, perfect. Here you go.
Okay, so just quickly, a little background. This legislation, Senate Bill 4-D, came about in the special session that was held in late April or mostly May of this year, because during the regular legislative session, there was several bills that were designed to address the structural integrity problems that led to the Surfside Champlain Towers collapse. I mean, this was a hot button item, very much people looking to the legislatures to do something. Well, they ended the regular session having passed nothing because they could not agree back and forth, and nothing got passed. And there was a lot of political heat on the politicians as to why you didn't pass anything. So they held several special sessions in 2022, which are extra sessions after the regular session. One of them, the last one, was on insurance. So they piggybacked on the insurance special session and basically pushed through Senate Bill 4-D very quickly, really designed to just say, look, we did something. So that's admirable. But as with a lot of legislation, if you don't read it and really analyze it before you pass it, you end up with things that are kind of like, what does that mean? So we have a bill here that became law May 26, 2022. It is present today law. It has been analyzed and scrutinized very, very much in the last 3 or 4 months. And every time there are more questions. So there are a lot of questions about why did they do this and what does this mean? And to the best of our ability today, we're going to answer those questions based on not what everybody agrees on, because not everybody agrees on every part of this bill that it means this or it means that. I'm going to tell you what I believe is the general consensus of what the bill means. Certainly you may have a difference of opinion, but ultimately either the courts will decide or there's already what are called glitch bills in the works, which are bills designed to fix glitches in prior legislation. And there will undoubtedly be in the next legislative session, which starts in March of 2023 and goes through April, there will be a glitch bill, which is designed to address some of the questions that we're going to talk about today. How they'll go, yes, no, I'm not sure. I'm going to give you my best guess. But again, there's a lot of questions that we don't have definitive answers on. If there's anybody that tells you in some of these controversial areas, it absolutely means this, they don't know what they're talking about. That's their opinion. It may be the general consensus opinion, but there are so many ambiguities and kind of things that don't mesh perfectly with one section of this bill and the other, that I don't believe anybody can absolutely definitively tell you this is absolutely what it means. We can tell you what we think it means, and that's what I'm going to do today, but look towards the future for possible clarifications on these. So with that, I guess we'll get started.
Yep. And one thing I forgot to mention earlier, I hope that all of you who are in attendance actually got the email where we actually have a YouTube page up. Everybody always wants to get a recording of this, and we're working very, very hard to make sure we get these up. I think right now we're just about a week out after doing a recording that we can actually get it uploaded and put in there between going through all of our editing and quality control. So after this session, we'll work on getting that. Hopefully next week we'll put out that email, but you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, Managers and Directors Education, and you can actually rewatch this video as well as from previous sessions as well. So no need to ask if you can get a copy of this and all that fun stuff. You'll be able to click on it just yourself.
Okay, so who does what associations or what types of associations does this new law apply to? First of all, it applies to condominium associations and cooperative associations. That's associations under 718 for condos and 719 for cooperative, Chapter 718, 719 Florida statutes. It applies to condominium buildings in those communities that are 3 stories or more in height, okay? So Rain, I'm sure we have a question already.
Yeah, we have lots of questions about this 3-story thing, Richard. So what if our first floor is like underground and it's a basement? Does that qualify as a floor?
Well, that's a little different twist on the question. I believe it's 3 stories above ground in my opinion. So the usual question is, I'm not positive on that. You threw me a little curveball.
Okay.
I believe it's 3 stories starting from ground level. So an underground story, I don't think that would apply, but I'm not positive. What I can tell you, the question that most people have is, and which I can tell you the answer to, is what if the first floor is a parking garage or some kind of recreational lobby deck that doesn't have any units in it, and then floors 2, 3, and 4, or 2 and 3 have the units? Under the current statute, that's a 3-story building. It is no distinction as to what the first story might be. It may be parking, it may be commercial, it may be non-residential. That's a 3-story building under this law. If that first story is underground, I'm not sure it counts as a story. That's a great question. I'm going to look that up and we'll be ready for that one next time. But 3 stories or more above ground for now is what I'm telling you.
All right. So what about because we have a lot of condo associations that have separate buildings, and I've seen some of them where you have most of them are just 2 floors, but then you have one and it's actually a 3-floor. Okay. What happens in that when you have different buildings and only one has 3 floors? Yeah.
Presently, this law would only apply to that building that had 3 or more stories. And we're going to get into what that means. That means you're going to have to comply with this law, which has 2 components we're going to talk with. The other 2 buildings that were less than 3 stories would not have to comply. But the way the bill is written right now, they're going to have to pay for the costs of that 3-story building doing the milestone study and the reserve structural integrity reserve study, which we're going to talk about. So the costs will not be segregated in a standard condominium. Now, if you were a multi-condominium, which means more than one condominium managed by a single association, then you probably could segregate the cost. But if you're a single condominium with low-rise buildings and high-rise 3 stories or more, everybody's going to pay for that 3-story or more building to do these studies.
I think we beat that one pretty good, and I hope everyone is nice and clear about that whole 3-floor thing.
Right. And also, so it applies to 3 stories or more, and there are 2 parts to the bill. There's milestone inspection studies, and then there's a second section of the bill called structural integrity reserve study. The milestone inspection study is designed to, if your building is at least 25 years old and you're 3 miles or within 3 miles of the coast, or if you're 30 years old, no matter where you are, you have to do a milestone study on the anniversary or of the year of your anniversary of your 25th year or your 30th year. And you calculate that 25 or 30 years from the date of CO, which is the certificate of occupancy, which is the date the building was available to be occupied. If you're already 25 or 30 years old, it doesn't matter. You're going to have to do these by December 31, 2024. The difference is if you're within 3 miles of the coastline, you've got to do it on your 25th anniversary. If you're more than 3 miles from the coastline, or 3 miles or more, you got to do it within 30 years of your thing. So I know there's always a question on the coastline.
Yeah. Do you know if they've defined anywhere what means coastline? Is that like riverfront or waterfront, or
yes,
how do they describe that?
The statute says, this bill says it's coastline as defined in section 376.031 of the Florida statutes, which means the line of the mean low water line along the portion of the coast that is in direct contact with the open sea. Okay. What that means is basically if you're within 3 miles of the Atlantic Ocean or 3 miles of the Gulf of Mexico, because those are the only two coasts we touch, or the water bodies that we touch, then that applies. So if you're within 3 miles, you got to do the milestone study within 25 years of the CO. In any case, if you're over 30 years already, or you're over 25 already, or you will be over that by December 31, 2024, you're going to have to do the milestone study. And this again is for buildings 3 stories or more in height.
Okay. And now one thing that I have done some work on the other coast of Florida, on the East Coast. And I know that some of them there, they have different types of qualifications or criteria that they have to have different types of inspections. Is that something that people really need to be aware of and attuned about? Because this is just Florida, correct? But counties might have different requirements.
Yeah, this is Florida, universally Florida. What you're talking about, Rain, I believe, is in Miami-Dade and Broward counties for years from a prior collapse, prior to Surfside, years ago. They institute a 40-year building inspection study, which is similar to the phase studies we're going to talk about, the milestone inspections. So they already had a 40-year requirement. The question always comes up, well, what if we're one of those and we already did our 40-year requirement last year because we met our 40 years? Because the components of that 40-year study are very similar to the components of this. The answer to that question is the current law makes no distinction or exception for the fact that you've already done the 40-year study in those 2 counties. However, I would think that the engineer or whomever did those studies for you, and it would have to have been an engineer, could probably piggyback on that data and turn it into the required milestone study. So that would be certainly something you want to talk about, and hopefully at a lesser cost, but you'd want to talk to them about that.
Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in, talking about this 3-floor thing or 3 miles from the coast or any of this. So hopefully everybody that's in attendance here is good with this and we're ready to move on to the next one.
Okay. And some of it we can go a little quicker.
Yeah.
So after the milestone inspection study, after you've done the first one, after your 25th year or your 30th year, you got to do it again every 10 years thereafter. Okay. And it's an association expense for these. Now, there is an exception, which I guess I should have talked about before. If you're a 3-story condo or cooperative building and you only have 3 units or less in the building, this doesn't apply to you. Okay. So that would mean, let's say the first floor is unit 1. It's just a big unit. Maybe it's the whole ground floor or part of the ground floor. Unit 2 is the second floor and unit 3 is the third floor. You're a 3-story building, but you have 3 or fewer units. In those cases, this milestone study would not apply to you, nor would what we're going to talk about next. But that's another little exception. And I do have some clients that have, for example, a 3-story building where there's 3 units. Each floor is a unit. So that's an exception.
Okay. Did not really know about that before. Thank you for clarifying, because I'm sure we do have some of those little itty bitty associations, and it's important for those people to know about that.
Sure. Okay, so what is the milestone inspection? It's first of all, it has to be conducted by a licensed architect or engineer licensed in the state of Florida. My understanding is it's not just any engineer or necessarily any architect. Engineering wise, it has to be an engineer that is can give a structural integrity reserve qualification or has the skills to do that. Not every engineer is going to be able to do this. An engineer that I suppose works on roads and lakes would not be doing this. They got to have a background in building, construction, etc. So it's conducted by an architect or engineer of the building, including load-bearing walls and primary structural members as defined in the statute. They must attest to the life safety and adequacy of the structural components of the building. It's really just a report that says your building is sound and structurally safe and can be occupied, or it says otherwise. And we'll talk about that. There's two parts to the milestone inspection study, two phases. Okay. Again, if you're already over 30 years or 25 years old, which means your CO was before July 1, 1992, the first date any of you have to worry about in this, if this applies to you, is this has to be done by December 31, 2024. That's when if you reach your 30 year or 25 year now already, or will by these dates, you have to have this done by December 31 of 2024.
All right, so here's an interesting question that came up, Richard. So someone says, does this milestone inspection, does the cost of this, can they put this as a reserve item that they can collect over time to be part of the reserve fund?
Yeah, technically it wouldn't be it would be like, I mean, Rain, this is kind of your area. It technically wouldn't be a reserve in the sense that it's a capital item with a defined life, but it would be a determined expense that will have a timetable. So what I think you're really asking is, can you create a line item in your budget or even in your reserves that starts to collect the money for the cost of doing this study? Well, first of all, if you're about to meet these deadlines, you don't have much time. If you're going to meet these deadlines in 5 or 10 years, sure. And I have seen quotes already from engineers that are pretty wide. I've seen some as little as, let's say, $6,000 or $7,000, and I've seen some as high as $20,000, and there's probably some that are higher. So I think it would behoove anybody that this is going to apply to is get a ballpark of what it's going to cost and then determine whether you should start saving for it now and how much time you have to do it. So I don't think that's a bad idea.
Yeah, I've encountered similar to like what you're saying. I've heard some associations try to get the bids out for these. In addition to the cost, it's timing as well. Some of these companies that are preparing it, as you can imagine, I read somewhere there's like 40, 50,000, community associations in Florida that are likely going to have to do this. So there's tons of associations that are going to need to have this done. And there's not quite as many firms out there that are able to do some of this. So I know a lot of them are hiring like mad and crazy, but they are months and months and months behind.
And that's a great thing. One thing I've heard, which you all ought to check into, that some people are saying, well, if we do the study now and they change the bill next year, have we wasted our money? First of all, we do not anticipate significant changes to this bill next year. It's called a glitch bill to correct little glitches. The biggest change that possibly could happen, which is historically when they put deadlines like this on condos and HOAs, they tend to kick the deadlines down the road. They did it with the fire sprinkler retrofit bill, if you all remember that, which had to be completed by 2012, and then by 2014, and then by 2016, and ultimately by 2021. So they may kick these dates down the road. I wouldn't bank on it, especially if you're already in the window of having to do this. But what I've heard some engineers are doing is creating like a waiting list where you can put down a small deposit now, and then you'll be given priority to get the inspection done. So that's something you may want to look into.
All right. We had another question that came up about the whole 3-floor thing, and this one's a little bit tricky. So hopefully you can catch on to it. It says, one stack of my buildings is 3 floors, 1 unit on each floor. that attaches to a 12 two-story unit? Are they included?
I think yeah, I've heard of this before. First of all, that's a single building. Okay, it's one building. Part of the building is more than 3 stories, and part of it's not. So yes, it's certainly going to apply to the part of the building that is the 3-story or more tower. Absolutely. The question, and these questions, I got to tell you, we've given this seminar 3 or 4 times now. In the beginning, they were very broad questions. And every time they get more and more specific and making it harder and harder to give a really good answer. So I would have to say that it's going to, here's why, and I'll explain this in a minute. It's going to apply to the low-rise portion of the building as well. Because I believe an engineer, and I'm not an engineer, an architect will tell you that if that low-rise portion failed, it supports part of the high-rise, I suppose. And if the low-rise portion fell or caved in or sunk, I suppose the building tower part would be compromised structurally. So that's a great question for an engineer. Legally, I'm going to tell you, I'll bet it's going to apply to the whole building, but that's an excellent question.
Good. I'm glad we can challenge you today, Richard. We don't want to make it easy on us. We want to keep it fresh and challenging. All right, so let's move on to our next slide. There we go.
Okay. We'll go over this very quickly. The law requires that the local enforcement agency notify you by certified mail when your inspection is required, and then you're required to do the inspection within 180 days after receiving the notice. I'm going to tell you, I wouldn't sit back and wait for the local building agency to notify me and say, well, we know we're past the dates, but I never got the notification, so I'm not going to do anything. I wouldn't take that position. If you know from talking to your lawyer, your legal counsel, that you're within the window of having to do this under the law, I would not, whether without getting the notice that they're required to say, hey, remember, you got to do this, I would do it. Because legally, if there was a problem and the building had a problem and your defense was, well, I knew we were in the window of having to do this and past the deadline, but since I didn't get the notice, we didn't have to do it, and we're not responsible for all the harm that our failure caused. That ain't going to fly, folks, I don't think. So don't wait to get the notice. I would, if your lawyer tells you you've got to get it done and you're within closer than the time for getting the notice, just get it done. That's my recommendation.
All right, sounds good.
Okay, so there's 2 parts to a milestone inspection. There's phase 1 and phase 2. I'm not going to go into all the detail because I know we have a lot of questions. Basically, phase 1 has to be done. And what it is, it's a visual inspection without destructive testing, where effectively they visually walk around the building and look at the ceiling and look at the floors and look at things that from a visual perspective would indicate to a qualified engineer or architect that there's a bigger underlying problem. If you pass the phase 1, that's all you got to do. You don't have to go to phase 2. If you pass phase 1, then they will prepare a report under seal, which means their license is on the line, that says you have passed phase 1. And then you have to turn over that report to the local agency that has control over your area, and you have to put it in the official records, and they have to make an executive summary of the report, and you have to give that to all the owners and anybody that is going to buy a unit that wants to see it, or a renter that wants to see it, and post it on your website and post it on your bulletin board. So if the phase 1 report says everything's good, that's easy. You tell everybody we passed phase 1, here's the report. We don't have to do anything until 10 more years, so we're good to go. That's the best news for you, that phase 1 you pass. Now, the next thing is, and let's see what the next slide is, Rain. I'm not going to go into all this. I mean, the engineer will tell you if you pass phase 1 or pass 1. Minor imperfections, small cracks are not going to be a failure. It's when the engineer says, that's a crack that I can tell is indicative of an underlying bigger problem. So don't freak out that you see cracks and little deterioration and some delamination. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to fail phase one. It might, but it doesn't mean you're going to necessarily fail. The engineer knows what is indicative of a bigger problem and what is just surface normal stuff. Again, I'm not an engineer. Okay. So what happens if the building fails phase one? What happens is you have to go to phase two. Phase two is a much more invasive, destructive testing, opening up walls, digging holes, and looking at things with a much more critical eye of that. Phase one, is just a visual. Phase two is an actual. We're going to have to look for spalling and probably take off some walls and look behind them and all of these things. So much more invasive. Also, I think we had a question that you were going to talk about earlier, Ray. What happens if you, first of all, if you fail phase one, you have to do phase two, okay? You don't have a choice to say, no, we don't. Now, I know, Rain, there was a question about, can we get another engineer that says we passed phase one? Here's my thoughts. The statute does not contemplate that. I think it would be a big expense to get another engineer to try to tell you you didn't fail phase one. And I think you would have a very, very difficult time finding an engineer that I think would be reputable to go, not that they wouldn't go against a fellow engineers, there's battle of engineers all the time, but to get another engineer to say, no, the phase one, you didn't fail, it would be costly. Number two, I think it would be difficult to find them. And honestly, the law doesn't contemplate that. You would have to disclose that to the local building people. And I guess they would have to decide if we're gonna let you go with the opinion two versus opinion one. I would bet they're not gonna let you do that. And maybe you have to get a third one. So I really wouldn't think that way. Get a reputable engineer that's qualified in this area. And folks, you live with what they tell you. Life and safety is on the line. So I think that's the real goal here is just, stop people from getting hurt. So phase two, destructive testing.
Now, what about like phase two? Let's just say you go through phase one and you didn't pass. Do you have to immediately start phase two, or do you have any type of time limit, or maybe
I believe, again, I don't have that kind of detail, but there is a time limit of when you have to do phase two. You can't say, well, we're going to wait 7 years and go to phase two. You have to timely do phase two. Now, the problem with phase two is if in phase two, what they're going to identify is structural integrity problems, and they're going to identify what the fix is, okay? And the engineer's in control here. You have to do what the engineer says. The engineer says the balconies must be removed and replaced. You're going to have to remove the balconies and replace them. So, or whatever, the engineer is basically in control. And if you fail to do these inspections when you're supposed to, it's an later slide, it's a breach of your fiduciary duty as an individual director, and you could be personally held liable. So again, get a qualified engineer. I don't think they're looking to make you spend money, but they're looking to make the building sound and safe. Also, if you fail phase two in such a degree that the engineer believes the building is presently unsafe to be occupied, they can order the building to be vacated. So that would be a severely, and I think after Surfside, Champlain, I believe I recall several instances in the same area where the towns and communities did order a few buildings to be vacated because they were in such bad shape. So that is the worst case scenario of failing the phase two.
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions that came in related to this. One of them I think we've addressed, but we just want to be sure. So in this phase one report, if the normal maintenance types of things with some cracks, the person here was talking about they normally every year they do a visual inspection in the concrete and they always have a little bit of spalling going on. Is that normal maintenance type of things? Those are not expected to pop up during that phase one inspection report. Is that correct?
Well, I've seen a phase one report already. And what it showed with the one that I saw, it's the first one I'd seen. The first one I saw, they passed phase one. Okay, they weren't required to go to phase two, but the phase one report did identify that within the next 3 years, you need to do X. Within the next 4 years, you need to do Y. So I don't think you're going to be able to ignore those recommendations, even though you passed phase one. So, you know, the information you get, I mean, it may identify some of the things that the writer was asking about, and you may say, well, we do that already. But in the report I saw, there were some significant things. They said this needs to be done within the next 10 years, et cetera, et cetera.
Nice. And then another question that had come up, they wanted to know if they could actually start the inspection actually now. And I think that's allowed. Can you confirm?
Yeah, and I have some. In fact, I've seen a phase one already. And even though it wasn't due until December 31, 2024, they already did it. And their question to me was, who is the local agency we deliver this to? And I said, well, the government hasn't caught up with that yet. I told them who I thought it would be, but I said, call the building department and see if they're working on setting up a special division for this. So I told them I wasn't sure because you're the first one I've seen. So, but yeah, you could do it now.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right, well, I think that's our questions for this. Let's go ahead and move on.
Okay, so phase two milestone inspection. It'll be extensive or as limited as necessary as determined by the engineer. How to assess the distress damage. Also serves the function of determining how to assess and repair the distress damage. That's what I talked about. The phase two is going to tell you what you have to do to fix this. And the engineer is supposed to give some deference. They're not going to go into every unit. They're going to do enough units or go into enough places with the least intrusive as possible to render an opinion they can put their engineer licensing seal on. So I don't think you have to worry that they're going to go in everybody's unit, but there are going to be some people, some unit owners that are probably going to be upset that, hey, you picked my unit, but that's up to the engineer.
All right.
Okay, so what if the repairs are required? The county commissioners will adopt an ordinance requiring the association to schedule the repairs within a specified time frame. Here's the answer to that other question. Repairs must be commenced no later than 365 days after receiving the report, okay? So you have a year to commence. That doesn't mean complete. That means start the repairs. Now remember, this phase two report, once it's delivered under seal to the local agencies, has to also be delivered to all the unit owners, put on your website. An executive summary has to be placed on the bulletin board and provided to any prospective buyer or renter. So thinking you're going to be able to deliver a phase two report to prospective buyers, they're going to ask, well, when are you going to do this stuff? Insurance companies are going to ask, well, when have you started this? Banks are going to ask. They're going to know all this report. So you're not going to be able to hide this, and it will significantly impact, in my opinion, the sales in your building, unless you have, you know, here's the report, here's our schedule of repairs. They've already started. That would lessen the impact of the bad news that's going to be in the report. On the other hand, if you provide, if you say, well, we don't know, that's not going to help sales. So you're not going to be able to hide this from prospective buyers, lenders, or insurance companies, and they're going to want to know, get this thing started. Where are you on the repairs? When are they going to be done? They're going to need to know all this. Again, if you fail to submit the report within the required time frame, the local agency with the engineer could determine that the building is unsafe for occupancy. So that's how important this is.
So we had a really interesting question the last time that somebody asked about this, and I was like, huh, it's creative. It's a creative way of thinking. Their question was, will the insurance cover any of this? Will the insurance cover any of these repairs?
No, because insurance covers a building, doesn't cover normal wear and tear or deterioration of the building. It covers these items for casualty loss, an insurable event, which is like a hurricane, a fire, vandalism, things like that. So your insurance is not going to cover, you've got an old roof, it's time to replace it. That's not how it works for insurance.
I thought it was creative. It's an
Hey,
interesting way. Like, hey. All right, so let's go ahead and move on.
Okay, so once phase 1 and if necessary phase 2 are completed, the inspector performs it, puts it under a license seal. We've talked about that. That just means their license is on the line. We've already pretty much talked about all this.
All right.
Okay. This is the part you've got to distribute the report to each owner regardless of the findings. You must deliver it by U.S. or personal electronic mail to those owners that previously consented to it that way. A summary by the inspector must be posted on a conspicuous place on the property. So you don't post the 55-page report. You have to propose like an executive summary. The full report, though, must be posted on the website. And if you fail to complete the study, then it's a breach of the officer's or director's fiduciary duty, which could lead to personal liability. So it's not something to think you can play games with.
All right, Richard, we had somebody request this, and I don't know if I can maybe put you kind of on the spot of this. Can you maybe in 1 or 2 sentences just kind of summarize this whole milestone inspection report process?
Yeah. It must be done with, if you're within 3 miles of the coast, it has to be done once you reach 25 years old. If you're more than 3 miles, that's 30 years, every 30 years from the date of CO. Then after you do the first one, you got to do it every 10 years thereafter. It's got to be done by a licensed engineer or architect from the state of Florida. It has 2 parts. Phase 1 is a visual inspection. If you pass that, you have to notify everybody and that's it. If you fail that, they have to do a phase 2, which is much more detailed and will determine what structurally is wrong with the building and order you to perform certain repairs, which must be done within 365 days, commenced within 365 days. The cost is a common expense of all owners. That's it in a nutshell.
Perfect. Well, it's good sometimes for everybody just to get that refresher, because sometimes we get down into so much detail. We need to make sure that everybody understands big picture. All right, just a couple of quick rapid fire questions that always come up because there's tons of confusion. Okay. All right, is this milestone inspection different than a 40-year construction report?
Legally, it is different because it has different requirements, but I think essentially it's very similar in what they're trying to do and look at. So can you use your 40-year report in place of this? Under the current law, the answer is no. Can you use your 40-year report? And again, this is for Dade County and Miami-Dade and Broward, who have these 40-year report requirements. I believe they're the only 2 counties that do. Can you use that information to create this milestone inspection? Yeah, I believe a lot of the data would be relevant depending on how recent it was.
Okay. Is this the same or is this different from a reserve study?
Yes, it's different. We're going to talk about that next, but a lot of the information determined in this milestone study will go into the reserve study as well. And typically they'll be prepared, at least my thinking would be prepared by the same company.
Okay.
That's the next section we're going to talk about.
Yep. And it is different from insurance studies that we might have periodically.
Yeah, insurance study is really to determine the replacement value of the building. Okay. Now, of course, they might say, we're not going to insure you unless you replace the roof in 2 years. I mean, they do that. So, I mean, there's some comparable moments, but your insurance study is not going to be in place of this milestone study in any way.
Right. So the big thing that I want everyone that's listening to really articulate and to understand: reserve studies, milestone inspection, the one that we're going to talk about here, the structural integrity report, the 40-year certification. They're different requirements of different people. So when you go to an engineer and you're requesting information, make sure you're clear in articulating what specific type of report you're looking for. So that way you don't get something that maybe doesn't quite meet the requirements of what the statute is or what you're actually trying to achieve. All of these are slightly different. Many times, certain information may overlap and be very similar, but don't waste and don't go down these rabbit holes where you're requesting something or you think you have the right report when it really doesn't meet those qualifications. All right, that's my little summary in a nutshell. Let's go ahead and move on.
Okay. This just says that they're going to continue to review this law. They're going to determine, with the advice of the building commission and fire marshal, additional recommendations, et cetera, et cetera. There's going to be a constant kind of review of these reports and tweaking of the requirements as they come in. My understanding is they're also going to require the engineers and architects to use kind of a standardized form for the reports, so that when you're looking at two different companies' reports, you'll find the data in the same places. So they're gonna try to make this a little uniform, is my understanding.
Okay, and we're talking about how after you have the first one done, it's 10 years. Is it every 10 years thereafter, or is it they just said 10 years after the first report?
No, after you have your first report, 10 years later, you got to do it again.
And then 10 years later, do it again? Okay.
Yep. It's every 10 years.
Perfect. And you could hire the same company if you wanted to hire the structural integrity report and the reserve study. And, some companies can do multiple different reports. Is that correct?
Sure. Yeah. I believe a lot of these engineers are doing both of these reports.
Perfect. All right.
Okay. This is part of the law that just says community managers. It's part of that have a contract with an association that has a building on the property that is subject to this law. The manager or firm must comply with with the board as directed. I'm not really sure what the purpose of this law was, other than saying that if the manager refuses to do what the board tells them to do in regards to preparing and obtaining these reports, the manager is violating their license as well. I'm not really understanding the purpose of this. Of course, the manager is generally going to do what I have found, and again, nothing against boards, but what I have found, the manager tells the board what it's supposed to do, and the board doesn't want to do it, so they say, well, we're not going to do it. This is kind of written to say that the board has to tell the manager what to do, and the manager has to do it. That's not generally the problem I find, but again, it's bringing the management community into this to be on the hook to some degree to make sure this stuff is getting done where applicable. So we're ready for the next one, I guess.
Yep. Are you on there? This is talking about the structural integrity report.
Okay. Okay. So remember, for the phase studies, the milestone studies, they kick in when you're 25 or 30 years old. Okay. And if you're already that age, you got to do this by December 31, 2024. This is the second half of the bill. This is what's called the Structural Integrity Reserve Study, SIRS, Structural Integrity Reserve Study. This is like your traditional reserve study for painting, paving, and roofing and capital items of $10,000 or more, but it has more components, which we're going to get into. Now, this is the big distinction between the twos date-wise. The requirement to do the Structural Integrity Reserve Study is, in my opinion, for buildings 3 stories or more with at least more than 3 units, okay? Same requirement for the milestone study. But the requirement to do the reserve study is not contingent on how old your building is, okay? It doesn't matter if your building is 5 years old or 10 years old or 14 years old. By December 31, 2024, you got to do a structural integrity reserve study. That's the law. The law for this half of the law, it does not make a distinction as to the age of your building, okay? And what a structural integrity reserve study is like any other reserve study. It's to look at certain components of the building, determine how long their useful life is, make an estimate on the replacement cost at the end of that useful life, divide the number of years left in the useful life into that cost, and it tells you how much you have to collect each year for that particular item. Just the same thing you do today for painting, paving, and roofing and capital items of $10,000 or more, like an elevator, okay? It's the same analysis, but it's more components, which we're gonna get into in a minute, okay?
All right, so Richard, this applies condos, it applies co-ops, is that correct?
Yes, 3 stories or more, and more than
more.
3 units. Now, there is some debate because this section of the bill does not continue to say for 3 stories or more, but the first half of the bill does. So this is an area that will probably be addressed in the glitch bill. Most of us believe, myself included, that this requirement to do this extra type of reserve study only applies to buildings 3 stories or more with more than 3 units. But you can parse the language in this half of the bill and say, well, they left out that phrase about 3 stories or more. So this must apply to every condo or co-op, whether you're 1 or 2 stories. I don't hold that opinion. Most of my colleagues that I've discussed this with do not hold that opinion. I believe this will be clarified in the glitch bill, but it could be clarified the opposite way most of us think. But I'm not banking on you having to do this extra reserve study if you're not a 3-story or more building. So my opinion today is this is the same requirement that the first item is, are you 3 stories or more? If the answer is yes, you got to do a structural integrity reserve study by December 31, 2024.
Perfect. Perfect.
And every 10 years thereafter. Now, here's the big difference. And I didn't just paraphrase this. This is the list right out of the statute that says this is what a structural integrity reserve study consists of. Like today, you have painting, paving, roofing, and capital items $10,000 or more. Well, first of all, you'll notice they've now moved the roof over to this side. They've moved painting over to this side. So these, and I'll tell you the distinction in that in a minute. So in addition to doing a structural integrity reserve study for these items, you also have to do it for load-bearing walls or other primary members, structural members. The floor, does that mean every floor or the ground floor or what? They don't say, it just says floor. Foundation, which is an odd one because you don't even insure the foundation, because the foundation is considered to last the lifetime of the building. So that's one that's creating a lot of scratching of heads. How do we reserve for the foundation? Because if we have to replace the foundation, essentially we're going to be tearing the building down. So again, a little bit of a head scratcher. Fireproofing and fire protection systems. Well, you might ask yourself, as I and others have, what does the fireproofing and protection system have to do with structural integrity? I'm not an engineer, but I don't think it's having the system or not does not affect the structural integrity of the building. I don't believe the building will fall down if you don't have the fireproofing. Now it might burn down, which it shouldn't. So maybe that's where they're going with that. Same thing with plumbing. And what does this mean? All the plumbing, just the common element plumbing, the plumbing that only serves the units or the common, they don't distinguish. It just says plumbing. Again, these are areas that may be clarified next year. Electrical system, again, is that structural integrity? Well, according to this statute, it's in the structural integrity reserve study. Waterproofing and exterior painting. You'll notice painting has been moved over from the other type of reserve. The big one that everyone is asking, windows. Does this mean all the windows in the building? Does it mean only the windows that serve the ground floor common elements or certain common areas? Or does it mean the windows that serve the units? And does it mean only if the windows have to be repaired and replaced by the association? And we all know there's a lot of buildings where the windows are the responsibility of the owners. So do we have to reserve for those? Again, this is an area that the law simply doesn't say. It simply says, what's part of this study? Windows. So when somebody tells you, oh, it only means non-unit windows, they don't, it might, but there's nothing that tells us that yet. Now, again, I believe windows will be clarified in the glitch bill. And then finally, this big catch-all here, any other item of deferred maintenance expense or replacement cost that exceeds $10,000, and the failure to replace or maintain such an item negatively affects any of the items listed here above. Okay. My example for that would be a seawall. If you have a seawall, it's certainly going to cost more than $10,000 to replace. If the seawall failed, would it affect the structural integrity of any of these other items, like the foundation? I think an engineer will tell you, depending on how close to the seawall the building is, certainly it would. So you might have to be now reserving for the seawall or some other component that they asked about. So this is some of the most, if you really look at these items and you really take them literally, all windows, plumbing, fireproofing, foundation, all floors, all load-bearing walls, the roof, you're essentially reserving for the replacement of the entire building, which I think most people believe is absurd, because you're never going to replace the entire building in this sense. So this is an area that's received a lot of scrutiny as to why am I going to be reserving for items like the foundation? If the entire building needs to be replaced, I don't know. It's some of this doesn't make any sense, but I'm telling you, this is what the law says.
Yeah, it pretty much gets to the point where it feels like you're replacing the entire building, including the kitchen sink, if it costs more than $10,000.
And it affects the structural integrity, which it's part of the, well, you're right. Is the kitchen sink part of the plumbing system? It's a fixture on the plumbing system. I don't know. Again, these are unanswerable questions under the current language we have in the bill.
Yeah. And I think what really gets scary with it is everyone can start to see big numbers creeping up really quick when you start talking about this. And it gets to that point of like, how is anybody going to be able to afford living in association if you have to save money to basically rebuild the entire structure? Just not really economical.
Exactly. That's the biggest criticism. And now the other big catch on structural integrity reserves, which are the ones on this list, versus those other reserves, which presently will now contain paving and any capital item that's $10,000 or more that doesn't affect the structural integrity of the building. So now you're going to have, and the big distinction is this: traditional reserves and the ones that remain in what I call the traditional reserve category, which presently, again, this is for 3 stories or more tall buildings. So don't freak out if you're a 2-story building. This is for 3 stories or more. If you're 3 stories or more, you will have the traditional reserves of paving and any capital item at $10,000 or more. The distinction is you will be able to pool those reserves. You will be able to waive those reserves on an annual vote of the owners. You will be able to borrow from those reserves on a vote of the owners, just like you've been able to do all along. Since reserves came into being, they could be waived or reduced or underfunded or borrowed from on a vote of the owners. The big distinction here now is if any of those items are now part of this list, like the roof and the painting, the reserves for the structural integrity reserves can never be waived, must be fully funded, so cannot be partially funded, and cannot be borrowed from, even with a vote of the owners. And under the current wording, in my opinion, which may be covered in the glitch bill later, these are not reserves that will be able to be pooled. So that's where the dollars are going to go much higher, because you're not going to be able to waive the dollars you need to fund these reserves. They must be fully funded every year, and they can't be used for any other purpose, even within the pool under the current language. So this is the area that creates the largest, as Rain mentioned, the single largest economic impact on condominiums and co-ops that fall into this category, is that this is going to be a lot of money you're going to have to set aside for a rainy day, which may never come in your lifetime under the current wording.
Yeah, Richard, you brought up that really important thing that I think everybody needs to just be forward thinking about. If your association's 3 stories or more and you've waived reserves in starting what I think it's 2024, 2025, you will not be able to waive these required reserves.
Not the ones on this list. And I know there's also debates on when do you have to start funding these structural integrity reserves. In my opinion, the study is due by December 31, 2024, regardless of the age of your building. So my simple mind says that means these are going to have to be put into the 2025 annual budget. So the way I interpret this, these dollars will have to start to be collected in your 2025 annual budget.
Right. Yep. It's the same type of way that I look at this. Now, one question that we've had in the past that people have asked, they're just trying to get their head wrapped around some of this and trying to figure out how to segregate some of the money. So if your association has previously been using the straight line method of reserves and they have money that's already earmarked for roof, can they just, in essence, maybe transfer that or just change the name of that and start calling it the SIRS, the structural integrity reserve component?
Yeah, I believe absolutely if you're using this, which means segregated, non-pooled reserves, the roof is still the roof, whether it's in the waivable category, which it used to be, or now it's in the structural integrity reserve non-waivable category. So for the roof and the painting,
right,
if they're segregated now, I believe you can just move them over.
Okay.
Now, if they're in a pool now,
yeah,
which a lot of them are, that becomes a little more tricky, because if they're pooled, you're now using them I don't know about pooled. If they're presently pooled, can you move them without a vote of the owners? I'm going to say probably, but maybe not. So again, this is a question that we don't have an absolute answer to yet.
Right. All right. So I think we can move on to the next part of it, which I think we've covered some of this already.
Yeah, we have.
Okay.
See, so, you have to have them by December 31, 2024. If you fail to complete the study, it's a breach of your duty. Same idea. They can file a complaint against the association from the division if you don't do this. So again, this isn't something you can sweep under the rug and not do. We've covered some of this. All of these studies, the milestone, the SIRS, are official records. They have to be kept for different periods of time, et cetera. The reserve study for 15 years, the milestone study for 10. Also, it has to be posted on your website. If you're a condo or co-op, I believe it applies to co-ops too, that has 150 or more units, you have to have a website. You have to post it on the website. If you're not one that is required to have a website, you would not have to post it on your website. Annual budgets. So the proposed budget must include the most recent structural integrity reserve study. That makes sense. Effective December 31, 2024. This, we talked about this. You can't waive the structural integrity reserves. You can't use them for another purpose, and they must be fully funded. Now, fully funded, I've seen people say, well, does that mean on January 1, 2025, we have to have all the money necessary for the roof already in there? No, it's just like your traditional reserve study. If the roof has 10 years of life left on it, the report says it needs to be replaced in 10 years, and it's going to cost $100,000. Full funding would mean on January 1, 2025, you're going to have to collect $10,000 of the 10-year life on that. That's what full funding means.
Yep. And then there was a question that somebody had earlier, which perfectly kind of lines into the example you just gave. Let's just say you have that $100,000 component, but you already have 50,000 of it saved. Okay, so now you have half as much. So now you only need to fund 50,000 over 10 years. Then that means you only need to be contributing $5,000 each year. That would be the fully funding amount you need, and it would meet the requirements of what the statutes say.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
Okay, this is an interesting part. For even condos and co-ops that have not turned over yet, meaning they're still under developer control, if they're 3 stories or more or higher, the developer must perform the milestone inspection. So even if your building is not even 1 year old, but before turnover, they have to deliver, or at turnover, they're going to have to deliver you the milestone inspection study, which is, I don't know how that one got through on the developers. I mean, your building might be 1 year old, you're more than 3 miles from the coast. You don't have to do this study for 30 years, yet the developer has to do it on day one. I find that it's helpful to the Turnover Association for sure, but it's going to be an expense for the developer that he doesn't currently have. And it's part of the turnover package. The division is also, this is currently in effect now. The division is trying to collect a database of all the condominiums in the state of Florida that have buildings that fall under these laws, which is 3 stories or more in height with more than 3 units in the building. That database, you have to deliver that information to the Division of Condominiums no later than January 1, 2023. If you go on the division website, myflorida.com, and look for Division of Condominiums, there's a live fill in the blank electronic form where you can put this information in. Here's the thing that I think I've changed my mind on. When the law first came out, I thought, oh, okay, I only have to go and put that information in the website if I have a building that's 3 stories or more. If I'm a low-rise condo, I don't have to do this. I know some of my colleagues don't feel that's the case. They think every condo and co-op, regardless of whether you have a building that's 3 stories or more, has to go and do it on this website, which I think makes more sense because they want you to acknowledge so they can go look, okay, we're a condo, we have 2 buildings, they're only 2 stories in height. So you would fill in a section that says, how many buildings do you have over 3 stories? You would say 0. So I think better safe than sorry. And maybe the division has clarified this, I don't know. I used to, like I said, think, well, if you don't have a building that falls into the category, you don't have to do this. I think you probably do. So go ahead and do it. It can't hurt you. If you fill in the blank 0, et cetera, et cetera. But the division may have some clarification on that, or someone may already know and could update me. Okay, so they're going to prepare a list so that they can basically track this. Is this being done? That's the purpose of this, to probably do notifications to the county that here's the list of the buildings, the condos and co-ops in your county that have qualifying buildings, and they're going to check. So you're not going to be able to hide your 4-story building. It's there for everybody. Okay, so Q&A, I think we've got a lot of that done, but
yeah, we do. Well, let me go ahead and correct this. So I stopped sharing my screen. Then there's only just like a handful of questions that we have left, and then I have a couple of others here. So here we have a question here. This is interesting, and I hadn't heard of this. Someone had said, I've heard that there might be state loans available for associations or individuals. Is this true?
Okay, well, that person has heard what is now another offshoot of this, because everyone's saying, how are we going to pay for this? It's going to cost so much money that nobody will want to live here. There are what I would call in the early stages of what are called white papers, which are papers written sometimes by lobbyists, sometimes by industry groups, by interested players, where they prepare a document called a white paper, which talks about a problem, talks about the issues, suggests a solution, and tries to get the ball rolling on legislation to address these issues. And I have seen one white paper that is and again, I would say, this is years away probably, because legislation doesn't tend to move fast. But in a nutshell, what the concept of the white paper is that they would create districts or groups of buildings that fall into these categories, and they would allow them through private and public partnerships to create like a state agency that would effectively collect a small amount of money from the condos, I believe, and then sell bond. No, what it would do is it allows them to sell bonds on the bond market, and then the associations in the pool would pay back the bonds over a really long period of time. It's kind of like a CDD, Community Development District, or what's called a multi-service taxing benefit unit, or MSTBU, which basically means a group in a geographical area can have bonds sold on the bond market to fund certain projects like sewers and lights. And then the homeowners in that area pay back those bonds with a little bit of tax on their ad valorem taxes. And I'm probably screwing this all up because it's not my area, but that's the idea, that it would allow you to fund these projects over a much longer period of time and a much less impact. But that's just a concept. I believe there's some traction that'll get, but who knows?
Yeah. Well, it's definitely interesting. I hadn't heard of that one. So there may be a little bit of a little glimmer of something that may be there to kind of help in case anybody's kind of in a panic and really worrying about all this. So there's things in the works. And like you were saying, Richard, there's probably going to be some glitch bills, which is going to help to address some of the, I don't want to say bogus, but likely it's not intended to save money to completely redo the building. Right. So another question that we had come up was, do you hear any types of talks about in these glitch bills about them changing it and maybe changing it from a 3-story limit to maybe a 4-story or a 5-story?
Well, the committee that I'm on that is preparing a glitch bill, its focus is supposed to be on technical deficiencies. But I'll be honest, that has created a bit of a division amongst lawyers that practice in this area, that why are we just focusing on little technical glitches, like does it mean all windows or some windows? Does it apply to, these things? So there's another camp that says, why not take a substantive look at this bill and fix some of the substantive problems that do exist? So I'm not saying I'm on one side or the other, but the committees that I've been involved with have been pretty strongly focused on just the glitch technical aspects. It doesn't mean there aren't other legislatures that will go and bring other things, but the word we've been given is don't expect really substantive changes. The basics bones of this bill are there. You will get some tweaks, but you're not going to get, wholesale changes is the word that I've heard. Not that somebody won't try.
Right.
I wouldn't count on them. That's what I would tell you. I would put my money on most of this is going to stay pretty much the way it is.
Okay. Well, it's good to have at least a little bit of thought of maybe of something that we're going to be seeing in the next year or two. So here's another question that somebody had, and I do kind of understand this because I have some family that lives in a community that's mixed, where you have some single families and then you have some townhomes, and things can kind of get hairy and get ugly. So this question that they have here, and they didn't really clearly distinguish, but maybe you can help us out here. They're saying, what if a neighborhood is made up of condominiums of different ages? Does the cost for each individual building's inspection report or their reserve study that they have to do, does it get spread out over the entire community, or does it get spread out only over that condominium?
Well, that's a good question. And it all depends on how the condominium or cooperative, in this context, condominium was set up. If it's a single condominium with 2 high-rise buildings, meaning 3 stories or more, and 6 low-rise buildings, but it was established as a single condominium. And maybe high-rise building 1 is now 30 years old, but high-rise building 2 is only 27 years old. If it is a single condominium with one association managing the single condominium, the cost of that is going to be paid by everybody, even the low-rise, the way the building is written now. If it's what's called a multi-condominium, which is a single association with more than one distinct condo. Let's say there's the villa, ABC villa condos, which are 2-story villa condos. It's part of ABC Association, but there's also separately created condo called the ABC high-rise condo. So there are 2 distinct condominiums. That's what's called a multi-condominium. In my interpretation, the expense for that high rise would only be borne by the people in that high rise, because that's a unique multi-condominium accounting requirement that, expenses are unique to one condominium versus the others, even though they're managed by one association, are only apportioned to that affected condominium. So if you're lucky enough to be in that scenario, you wouldn't pay for the high rise. But if you're a single condo, you're going to be paying for the high rise, even though you have nothing to do with it, in my interpretation.
And I just want to share this with everyone. I've been working with community associations for about 20 years now. And about once every 2 or 3 years, I'll get an association who doesn't know if they're a multi-condo. And they want to argue with me. And they'll be like, well, we're separate buildings, but we're not, but we're this, but we're that. And what I always tell them is, I'm not giving you the answer. You need to have your attorney look at it and assist you and give you a clear answer. Because too often some associations, they do a merger and they say, oh, well, we merged, we're one now. And I kind of tell them, I'm like, yeah, maybe you think so, but did your attorney tell you that? Do you have that in writing? Because sometimes some of this language is so kind of buried in there and it's not so obvious. So don't just make an assumption that you are or you are not a multi-condo. Have your attorney give you that direction, so that way when you have these costs and you want to specifically make unit owners and building A pay for it, that you have the right to be able to charge just building A to pay for those expenses.
Right.
All right, another question that came up here. It's interesting. Do we have to use an outside firm to conduct the structural integrity reserve study, or can the board prepare the study?
No, the study, just like the milestone study, has to be prepared by a licensed architect or engineer.
Yeah. So maybe I have many associations who don't formally get reserve studies. They go ahead and get estimates of how much they're reserving for stuff. Those days are going behind us. In the future, if you're 3 stories or more, you're going to have to follow with what they say in there. All right, I think I have just about 2 more questions here. This one says, does the engineer accept liability by approving phase 1 for 10 years on the structural integrity of the building? I don't know if they'd be able to accept any liability.
If it's under seal, so I guess they would have some liability. If he said you passed phase 1 and the building fell down, I can guarantee you this is going to be sued.
Yeah. All right, and I think our last question here, because we are getting a little bit way late. Richard, can you give us kind of your insight behind some of the language that's in the bill? Do you think a lot of this was done to try to avoid associations from waiving reserves and to kind of kick these cans, down the road? What is your insight behind why the bill was kind of pushed and created? I mean, yes, for the obvious, but some of the other language that's in there about you're no longer able to waive reserves. What is your insight from where that came from?
I think because of the quick nature of passing this through, certain factions got things that they think are best for Florida. Like there's a group that, rightfully or wrongfully, and I'm not taking sides, don't think you should be able to waive reserves for certain types of things, which I think there's an absolute logic for that. There's another faction that says, hey, it's their building and they have to pay for it if they want to do that. Now, that factions have always been there for years, but then Surfside happened and it gave momentum to they shouldn't be able to waive reserves for really important stuff. And I think that got put into the bill because the political will was there to get it done this time, because Surfside had happened so frequently. So I think some things slipped in that people have always debated over the years. But as with most laws, in my experience or my looking at history, most laws that get put through quickly in a reactionary way to appease public outcry always have every bill has unintended consequences. Every bill of big legislation that goes through like that has way more. And that's what you're seeing here. Rightfully or wrongfully, there's some unintended consequences that with further study and proper debate on both sides of the aisle and issue probably would have come up with a much better bill, or at least one that is, I think, better. That's just my personal take. So I think it was the speed at which this was done that has led to the issues.
All right, wonderful. Well, we've answered all the questions that everyone has. Richard, you can see, Richard's email address up on the screen if you wanted to go ahead and jot that down, or you could always email us at managers and directors edu@gmail.com, and we'll be more than happy to address any questions that you have. We'll be getting this up on our YouTube page probably in the next week or so, and we'll also be emailing a copy of this presentation out to all of the attendees. But we thank you all so very much for joining us. Richard, as always, it's a pleasure to be presenting alongside of you, and we'll see you all next month.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.